haven't done one of these for a little while, have we? So
It seems to have been ages.
it does indeed. So welcome to our hopefully August book group.
Yep. And I'm going to be talking about two books that I've read quite recently. Both fascinating, incredibly different books. One is this one, which is The Wizard of the Kremlin. And the other one is this book here. It's called The Fisherman, and it's by Chiguzi Ibioma, who is one of my fellow Nigerians. So, we'll talk about those. And you?
Okay, I'm going to talk about a book by Salman Rushdie, who I've never read Salman Rushdie before, and this isn't one of his novels. This is called Knife, and it's an account of, I don't remember, a couple of years ago he was attacked on stage when he was giving a talk, and it's quite a moving account and beautifully written account. It's called Meditations After an Attempted Murder, so it sort of follows through from the actual attack itself through to his recovery and rehabilitation.
Right, okay. Well, I'll start with The Fisherman. It's a beautifully written book, absolutely fascinating. It's set in a southwest Nigerian town in, I suppose, the mid-1980s. And the book centres around a very middle-class family where the father is away working most of the time, and most of the bringing up of the children is left to the mother. There are 5 boys and 1 daughter, the daughter being the youngest. And the book it's everything. It's beautifully written. It's very, very Nigerian, or exposes a very not sort of Nigerian traits and values in everything from the way the parents react with the children and what the children go off and do after school hours, that sort of thing. But as I say, it's beautifully written, and it's a lot of things mixed up into one. It's a coming-of-age book. It's essentially a tragedy as well. But it becomes very, very more and more complex as the book goes on. It starts relatively straightforwardly with the 4 elder brothers going out playing after school into the bush. They discover the joys of fishing in a local river. Now, the river is something that was polluted apparently years ago, and everyone's been pretty much banned from going there. But they sneak off there without their mother's consent. And one day they come across the local madman, essentially, and he's known everywhere as the local madman. But he's also known to make prophecies. Now, what happens is that while he's doing some of his ranting, the elder brother, Ekena, has a bit of a sort of verbal altercation with him, and the madman spouts some prophecy to him. But just at that time, a plane goes over, so Ekena doesn't actually hear what he said. Now, this is really key to the whole story, because later on his younger brother, essentially he forces his younger brother to tell him what was said, because the younger brother did hear it. And in essence, what was said, or the prophecy from the madman, was that he would die a tragic death, the elder brother, at the hands of a fisherman. Now, the elder brother becomes essentially completely sort of consumed by this, and presumes that what he means is that one of his younger brothers will kill him. And then what happens is that he enters an incredibly distressing phase, I presume, as he sort of hits teens as well, whereby he shuts out his brothers, doesn't really converse with them, and everything goes dreadfully downhill from then on. And, without giving too much away, but what does happen is he does end up being killed by one of his brothers. And then the tragedy starts from there, with the entire family. But as the book goes on, it becomes deeper and deeper. It sort of becomes darker and darker, but not really, because there's still always hope. And that hope is tied in with the two younger brothers. But the relationships are fascinating between the brothers and their mother. Their mother descends into dreadful depression. So I won't give too much away what happens, but the entire family falls into tragedy, essentially. But it's told through the prism of the third brother, and his descriptions of his feelings for his brothers, and his stoicism, and the way that the father has imprinted such powerful values on them, really carries the book. And as you get towards the very end, you almost find yourself almost weeping at the tragedy of what's happened. But it isn't a sad book.
It sounds very sad. It sounds very dark.
No, it isn't dark at all, actually. I mean, dreadful things happen. And it's set against the backdrop of a lot of political troubles in Nigeria at the same time.
So does the killing of the older brother happen? Because I thought you were getting to the end of the book when you said he ends up being killed by one of his brothers.
No, that happens perhaps third way into the book.
And did you relate to him a little bit because there were 5 McNair brothers? And
yes, very
when
much.
You said he used to go out into the bush.
Well, very much so, I suppose, because Nigeria has always been a very matriarchal society, and a lot of, my father didn't, but a lot of men worked away from home. But boy, the mothers ruled the roost, and we'd go off into the bush after school, and sometimes at the weekend we would disappear into forest without telling my mother after breakfast, and come home at 9-10 o'clock at night, and get a sound beating as well. That's the other thing that happens through the book, that when they do misbehave, and they're quite naughty boys, in a charming way.
That's what you
well, yes, and they got beaten. The father and they just stood there and took it. They knew they deserved it. And I remember very clearly having the same sort of thing. When we did terrible things, punishment was handed out. Never by my father, always by my mother. And there was one very sort of time I can remember very, very clearly, where we'd have these medicines we were given regularly. It tasted dreadful. And when it was time for it, we'd often run away and hide.
Like a vitamin thing or something?
No, I think it was some anti-parasite thing or something.
Okay.
It was terrible stuff, little Antipa. And anyway, when we sort of finally returned, I think it's actually when we finally returned from a day in the bush with my eldest brother as ringleader, that my mother made us go into the garden and cut little whippy bits of stick. And she whipped us with it, and the indignity of having to cut your own stick to do that, and to this day I still laugh about it. I think I got 1. My elder brother was made a corporal, he got 2, and my eldest brother got 3, so he was always like that. But it's beautifully written, beautifully constructed, and tragic, but not sad, which is odd. But yes, so The Fisherman, I think a very, very enjoyable read.
Sounds it. Yeah. It's a little dark, despite what you say. Okay, so the book I've been reading, a few months ago actually I read this book, is, as I mentioned earlier, Knife by Salman Rushdie. Now, Salman Rushdie is not an author that's ever really appealed to me at all. This did, and I think my interest was piqued in this. I think I heard him talking about it on the radio, again, very eloquently, about such a terrible thing that happened to him. The book, a bit like yours, on the face of it sounds very dark because the actual attack was just horrendous, and the first chapter covers that in great detail actually. But actually the rest of the book is his road to recovery, his love for his wife, and sort of the hope of getting through it all. So it's sort of a triumph of hope and love and that sort of thing. And his journey is just amazing. So this guy just came out of an audience. He was giving a talk at a literary institution, I think somewhere in New York, and he saw this guy stand up in the audience and sort of run towards him, and his first thought was, oh, is it you? Because for 30 something plus years he's been sort of almost waiting for this to happen. Because remember he had the Ayatollah,
the fatwa or whatever.
Exactly that. So he's been aware that might happen for a long time, and so his immediate thought was, oh, it's you. And this guy came towards him and launched an attack that lasted, which doesn't sound very long actually, but 27 seconds. This guy was attacking him with a knife. He inflicted, I think, about 15 different wounds, including he put his hand up to try and ward this guy off, and he severed all the tendons and the nerves in his hand. He lost an eye. He had injuries everywhere, and in fact they thought he wouldn't live. Parts of it are quite amusing because when they managed to get the attacker off him and he was lying on the stage in a pool of blood, he heard somebody say, we need to cut his clothes off, and his immediate thought was, no, not my really nice Ralph Lauren suit. And it was those sort of things that he said, it's amazing things that come into your head. And the other thing he wanted to try and tell them was his house keys were in the pocket, so not to take his jacket away. So the first chapter deals with all of that. The second chapter is called Eliza, and it's almost like a love letter to his wife, and it's really lovely and it's beautifully written. It sort of details how they met. He'd sort of written off ever falling in love again. He was how old? 70-ish, early 70s, and he was happy with his life. He's got children, happy life, lots of friends. But he met her. She's a poet, and they were introduced and had an instant connection.
What happened to his first wife?
I think they're divorced.
Oh, right.
Yeah, I think he's got 2 previous wives, I think, from what I can gather. They were introduced, and as I say, they did a little bit of like flirting and that sort of thing. And he was about to go home when somebody said, look, there's a drinks reception on the roof terrace, do you want to come up? And he said, yes, let's go and have a quick drink. So they went up there, and he sort of very coolly said, let's go out onto the roof terrace and look at the city lights. Got them both a drink. She sailed through these doors, and he, not noticing that they were sort of glass floor to ceiling, just walked straight into a glass door, fell over, his glasses broke, he cut his face and had to go home. She actually went with him to make sure that he was okay, and it just all sort of went from there really. And it's a beautifully written love story. It really is.
I've not read any Salman Rushdie at all.
I haven't either.
I think it's, I think what is quite unfortunate is that he has a rather unfortunate, outward demeanour or manner, and can come across as rather arrogant.
I think there's an element of truth in that. I think he probably is a little bit.
And it's always slightly put me off actually reading any of his novels.
Well, it had me, but then as I say, I heard him, and the Audible version of this is lovely. He reads the Audible version. It's well worth a listen because what he actually went through, I mean, some of it's actually not very easy listen. He lost an eye, and there's an awful lot of great detail about how they tried to save his eye and the pain that he went through. I mean, some of the pain that he went through, he said it was just as close to unbearable as it could get, but it was worth it because they were trying to save his eye. I mean, ultimately they failed and he lost his eye, and the sight in it, obviously. But yeah, it's just an amazing thing. And at the end, he sort of comes to terms with it all. He gets through, I think, 13 months of sort of rehabilitation and treatment. His hand healed remarkably. Everybody didn't think it would, but finally he managed to get feeling back in his fingers and was able to use his hand again. And the end of the book, he goes back to the stage where the attack happened. He needed closure. He said it was like coming full circle. He took his wife back there. They stood on the stage and sort of almost closed it.
And does he comment on greater things, if you like?
Yes.
Because I know that when it happened, he was ironically attending an event tied in with creating safe spaces for writers across the world. Yeah, it was a charity that a friend of his had set up. He was sort of complicit in. So apart from obviously his story, does he touch on why writers now need these safe spaces?
No, he doesn't really, not really. I mean, he speaks a little bit about that charity and why it's needed, but he doesn't go into great detail about that.
Right.
He refers to the guy that attacked him as just A. He's just referred to as A, so attacker, adversary, assailant. He doesn't want to give him a name because he doesn't want to give him that sort of oxygen of publicity.
Yes.
One of the chapters, funnily enough, and there was a programme on BBC Two, Alan Yentob did, called Through a Glass Darkly, which was an interview with him, where they recreated a chapter in the book where he has an imaginary conversation with A, the attacker, the assailant. He sort of puts himself into his head and almost interviews him himself.
Wow.
So there's a whole chapter of Salman Rushdie talking in an imaginary way, obviously, to this guy. And they recreated that with AI and sort of digital bits and pieces on this programme on BBC Two. So that's well worth a watch as well, if it's something that interests you.
Well, no, I've not seen that at all.
But yeah, obviously he couldn't meet this guy, and he doesn't really want to, and finds it... You know how some people can forgive after something like this?
Yes.
He's not up for that.
It would be difficult.
I
Yes.
don't blame him. So yeah, I think on the face of it, it's not the sort of book that you would think is very uplifting, but actually it is. And I can see why he's sort of lauded as a great writer, because this is a beautifully written book. It really is.
Mm.
So yeah, if you feel like it, it's called Knife, Salman Rushdie.
Good. Well, the second book I'm going to talk about is this book here, The Wizard of the Kremlin, and a very contemporary novel, and it is a novel. The writer is Giuliano de Empoli, who I don't know at all. And I say it's a novel because it is, but you could easily believe that it was fact rather than fiction, and it's somewhere in between. The premise is that the writer, the protagonist, becomes Putin's right-hand man, or his fixer. And follows Putin's rise from being essentially a sort of KGB thug to the very top. And what is so interesting is that there's a lot of historical detailed fact in the book. And he puts himself in the position, and I don't know whether this individually even exists, of someone who Putin turns to, I wouldn't even quite say advice, but someone who Putin turns to get things done. And sometimes he's his advisor and his fixer, that sort of thing. But what is interesting, it is so believable that this character existed. And it's again, it's very difficult because it is fiction.
I was just going to say that it must be really strange reading a book that's factually accurate.
Yes.
It's actually a novel.
The problem in a way is that you start believing, perhaps often correctly, that everything that went on, the conversations, did actually happen, and they were true, because it is so incredibly believable that they were true. Everything from the way that Putin got fed up with the arrogance of the obviously incredibly wealthy Russian businessman who he had put in those positions. And then of course when things turn sour with them, off this chap is sent to sort them out. And these oligarchs of course really were very, very unhappy with what had happened. But it's difficult because it is a very, very fascinating insight into Putin's psyche. I don't know much about the author at all, but he must have done an awful lot of research or known the individual, if that such an individual existed, who was in that position. And so you come away, having read it, with quite an interesting insight into Putin's psyche, if it's true, but also the Russian psyche as well. And it helps one very much understand the way the Russians have related to Putin, the whole concept of strength and power, and corruption. So what? They respect and value is strength and power, and it's very nicely written. He's not too self-indulgent, but it's incredibly believable, and you do have to come away reminding yourself it's a novel. It's a novel, because
there must be a lot of truth in it, though.
Well, I think there must be. There's so much historical fact in it, and quite subtle historical fact, that you think, wow, now this. He must have known these things. I suppose anyone probably could have deduced these things. Certain things happened, but yeah, a very, very an easy read. It's not quite a thriller, but it almost is. And like so many of these things, it's a bit like reading some of the Second World War escape accounts. If you didn't know it was true, you wouldn't believe it. So yes, The Wizard of the Kremlin by Giuliano da Empoli.
So we're done. So you may have noticed Justine isn't here this month, or Ty Duncan gets to do 2 books, but she'll be back next month, hopefully.
Brilliant.
Okay.
Super. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, bye.
Bye.